We are witnessing America as a failed social experiment.
How do we tell this story in a way that builds the kind of emotional momentum that colorblind ideology built?
So many young brothers and sisters of the younger generation find themselves so far removed from the best of their past.
What are we going to make out of the nothing we've been given? How do you envision possibility? Welcome and thanks for joining us on the Tightrope. We have a show today designed to commemorate, to think about and reflect on and call attention to the assassination of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton 51 years ago this week in Chicago. And so we want to look back on this moment, and we have some great guests to do so. I'm Tricia Rose, and I'm here with my co-host and friend and colleague and mentor, Cornel West. Dr. West, how are you? How you holding up?
Oh, I tell you, I'm in good shape. I'm in very good shape in dialogue with you. And we got a dialogue with a very, very special, high quality, long distance freedom fighter just a few minutes here.
Yes, we do. We do. And, you know, this is a real interesting moment to be thinking about the 50 years ago, really. How do you think about this legacy? Not only of, you know, Fred Hampton, but the Panthers in general of Black radical protest. What you know, how does this moment compare for you?
You know, when I think of Brother Fred Hampton, I think of one of the highest levels of vision, courage, integrity, determination, and love and service for the people in the history of the country. He's part of the Black freedom struggle that has produced such figures, but he's one of the ones in the top pantheon because he had a quality of mind, he had a goldenness of heart. Most importantly, he had a willingness to sacrifice and serve everyday people. And as you know, my growing up on the chocolate side of Sacramento, California, in Shiloh Baptist Church, right next door was the Black Panther Party. I spent a whole lot of time there. I worked in the breakfast program. When I went to college, I worked at the prison every Sunday. After church in Norfolk, Malcolm's prison, that was all part of the Black Panther Party programs. And so they were fundamental in shaping who and what I am in terms of how you try to be of service for the wretched of the earth in the language of Fanon. And Fred Hampton exemplifies that. And of course, Mark Clark was also there from Peoria. Bobby Hutton was in Oakland. We was a number of brothers and sisters who have been murdered by the U.S. police and U.S. nation state. Mumia Abu Jamal, of course, is my dear brother. I just saw just a couple of years ago in prison. So, but most importantly, it's as you know, I like to stress the moral and the spiritual issues of this thing, that he was trying to authorize an alternative reality, and you only do it by means of vision, organization, and execution. And if you do it in a powerful way, the powers that be will try to crush you. And if you do it in such a way that you can get easily co-opted, then you're going to get celebrated by the establishment as you pose in posture for something that you're not. Fred Hampton was the real thing. So was Mark Clark, but Fred Hampton we know a bit more about. And there's just nobody like him. There's nobody like him.
Yeah. It's hard to see replacing that kind of visionary individual in this moment, and also the infrastructure, you know. Absolutely. Because the infrastructure you're describing, right? Sacramento, Norfolk, you know, Chicago, New York, everywhere. It's not quite present at the moment, right? There's not a place to go to coordinate centrally these kinds of activities. I mean, many people say that's a good thing because then it can't be taken apart, but it seems like the downside is it's harder to coordinate and to really sort of bring people into service on the ground en masse towards some kind of even temporary common goal.
Oh, it's true. It's true. I mean, we've had, you know, the largest protest demonstrations in the history of the American Empire just this summer. And so that's a sign that there's a fire still burning. A lot of people still willing to straighten their backs up and hit the streets and go to jail. But it's a very different historical moment. Now, we're experiencing the decline of the American empire. You see, in the late 60s, American empire was just at its height with economic growth and reshaping the globe in its own image with troops in Vietnam and Latin America, and influential in Africa. And Europe itself had been dependent for so long on the United States. Germany, West Germany was still a satellite state of the American empire. South Korea, satellite state of the American empire. Now, even given the protest demonstrations and so forth, America's in such decline and decay, is a different kind of tone and a different kind of spirit, it seems to me, in the Black freedom movement. But that's something that, as you can imagine, requires much more time to flesh out.
Right, right. No, that's critically important, and we're going to have our own conversation about that, whether it's on the tightrope or next to the tightrope, because that's a very important question, the moment we're in. And that really speaks to our fantastic guest Flint Taylor, who's really a bridge between that generation and those movements and today, who's been a consistent freedom fighter for racial justice and for humane treatment and against, state-sponsored violence for, decade after decade. So I want to welcome our fantastic guest, Flint Taylor, to the tightrope. And Flint's done amazing things. So successfully sued the FBI on behalf of Fred Hampton's family and Mark Clark. He co-founded the People's Law Center in Chicago and is the author of The Torture Machine, a terrific and really tough book to read emotionally, Racism and Police Violence in Chicago. Flint Taylor, you are on the tightrope. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be with both of you and to connect again with two of the best people in the struggle that I know.
Very, very kind, very kind.
We salute you, though, brother.
Yes, we do.
I tell you that. I mean, I know that the world knows already much of you, but more of the world needs to know of your work and your witness. When you think of William Kunstler and Charles Gary, you think of Flint Taylor, those freedom fighters within the legal context who are in genuine solidarity. And the younger generation needs to understand that. We're not talking about white ally in inverted commas. We're talking about a human being who chooses to be a person of decency, integrity, and courage, who is in solidarity with the chocolate side of town. In this case, it's in Chicago, as a law student at Northwestern, gets to call the chairman's crib, makes your way over, and lo and behold, a whole lifetime of a calling and a vocation in solidarity based on integrity. It's not about white identity, black identity, gender identity. It's about a human being who chooses to immerse himself in the struggle for those who are suffering. And that's what I see when I see Brother Flint. And that's what I want the world to see, because we need to be able to be in contact with these kinds of examples of such high integrity and courage, though, brother.
Well, that's certainly humbling and an honor to hear you say that. There was no other road to follow. As you mentioned, when I was a law student and got that call along with other law students and lawyers at the People's Law Office that we'd started just months before, that the chairman had been murdered, come to the crib. That was a life-altering event. As a young 22, 23-year-old white kid from the suburbs of Boston, or Worcester, Mass, as it were then, to be thrust into that situation, having met Fred Hampton, having been influenced by Fred Hampton only months before, and having worked with the Panthers for a short period of time, but our office and that's how we got our name, the People's Law Office, because as you know, the Panthers were all power to the people.
That's right.
The People's Breakfast Program, the People's Health Clinic, the People's Education Center. And so when we became some of their lawyers that would go to the courts on the front line when they would be busted again and again, from everything from selling the paper to attempted murder when the cops would raid their offices, they started calling us the People's Law Office. And it's a very heady and to live up to that term. But we've tried to, and we're still at it out here now, as you all know. So in some small way, we feel like we have contributed and continue to contribute to the struggle, particularly the struggle against police violence and racism and white supremacy.
Mm, mm.
We were noting earlier that this is the week of the celebration of the anniversary, not celebration, anniversary of the execution of our dear brother, John Brown.
Oh, wow.
And we tell young folk all the time that, you see, the choices you make, the commitments that you're able to enact and embody in your short move from mama's womb to tomb cuts so deeper than just skin pigmentation, just sexual orientation or national identity or gender. It's a matter of what kind of human being you are going to choose to be. And to the degree to which they're able to see the Flint Taylors and others of the world, and your wife, and now your daughter. I mean, it's a family affair in that sense of just choosing to be these kinds of human beings who seek truth and justice. It makes a difference, though, man. It really does make a difference.
Makes a huge and enormous difference. So, I have a few questions about Fred Hampton, but I want to ask you, Flint, when did you know that you were going to use your interest in the law in this way? Was it the Panthers that spurred you along? What happened earlier in your life that may have encouraged you? Because, as Cornel said, it's a family affair, but in the sense that family was created after you were already doing some of this work, right? So you had to have a reason to make this hard choice. I mean, it's not easy to be John Brown. It's not easy to be even approximate that kind of person in this world. There's so much pressure to go with the flow and so much reward for doing so, and so much less pain, suffering, and terrorism, right? That you yourself have certainly faced. So what gave you the courage, and what was the catalyst that encouraged you to go in this direction?
Well, it was the times, I think. It was the events. As you know, I graduated from Brown, of all places, in 1968. The year before, I believe Africana Studies was founded by the movement and the Black students at Brown. But that was the Vietnam War time, and I think the injustice and the violence and the imperialism of the Vietnam War, and starting to come of age at that particular time on a college campus, and then the assassination of first Dr. King, of course, and then Bobby Kennedy, who gave a lot of us young white folks some hope, because he was really speaking, at least it seemed like, to racism. He's speaking to poverty in a way that other leaders weren't, including Gene McCarthy at that point. But the events just pushed me along, and then I got out here to Northwestern, and it was fortuitous that my office was founded, and the lawyers that were older than me, although young and part of the movement lawyer-wise, were committed against all obstacles to represent not only the Panthers, but also the Young Lords organization, which was very powerful and important in doing very important things in the city. The Young Patriots, which was a young white group of Appalachian people who you can see in that movie Revolution 2, which is a very good movie for people to watch. And yet Rising Up Angry, another young group of white folk. And also Fred, of course, was trying to bring together with the Panthers and that movement, the Rainbow Coalition, which was the initial Rainbow Coalition. Jesse Jackson obviously popularized that term, but it was the Panthers and those other organizations that first brought that name and that concept together in the city. And so we were representing all those people, and you couldn't help but be impacted by the people you were representing, the Fred Hamptons, the Cha-Cha Jimenez, Mark Clark, Bobby Rush, all of the people we were representing, the groups we were representing, what they were trying to do, and what the government was doing to them. Of course, when I got that call on December 4th, 1969, I only had a vague idea of really the breadth of the government conspiracy, of course. Bobby Rush stood in front of that apartment that I was called to and gave a press conference. And at that point, he said, we lay this at the step of J. Who Edgar, which of course was J. Edgar Hoover. And at that point, I think people in the movement understood without having the documentation that there was some kind of program. We later learned, of course, it was COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program at the FBI. But they had the feeling and the understanding that this was a much broader attack than just some crazed white and black cops who worked under a state's attorney who was trying to make his bones by shooting up the Panther apartment. So all of that, it wasn't, I guess if you wanted to point to one event, of course, it would be the assassination of Fred Hampton, but it was the events, the times, the people I was working with, both in terms of the lawyers and law students I was with, and also, of course, the clients and the movements that we were helping to represent.
I tell you, something's happened at Brown University. I can tell you that. Still is.
There we go. There we go.
I'm thinking
Bruno.
about Jeff Stout, who's my very dear brother. He's one of the most distinguished philosophers, probably the most distinguished philosopher of radical democracy, who came right out of Brown at the same time. He just retired from Princeton just a few weeks ago. But he carries that Brown legacy with him. Something happening in Providence with the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. and RFK and the uprising in Detroit and Newark in 67 and flowing over into 68. And here we are now, 2020, and Brother Flint is still at it. How have you sustained your fire?
Well, I've been blessed with having relatively good health. I try to keep myself in shape, do a little running here and there. But as I said, it's there's ups and downs, obviously. There's going into court and thinking, well, either you're the only sane one there or you're the only crazy one, because you know what I mean.
I do.
Bringing forth evidence of government conspiracy, and that the FBI in fact planned and set up the Fred Hampton raid secretly and kept that a secret. And then you go into court and you're trying to uncover that, and you are uncovering that, and you have a judge that is like Tweedledum or Tweedledee to Julius Hoffman of the Conspiracy 8 fame, just completely against you, sending you to jail on contempt, laughing basically at your arguments that there's a conspiracy. But on the other hand, to be standing with the mother of Fred Hampton, Iberia Hampton, who came to court every day for 18 months when we fought the case. Fannie Mae Clark, the mother of Mark Clark, who came to court and listened to the slander of their sons for every day for 18 months. Doc Satchel, one of the ones who was shot up in the apartment but survived, who had to put up with going into the cafeteria and having one of the officers who shot him verbally assault him and threaten him. All of that, the strength and the courage of the people, that really sustains you through thick and thin. But I'd be lying if I didn't say winning some of those cases wasn't a real boost as well.
Yeah.
Thing if we went through 13 years fighting the Hampton case and nothing came out of it, or if we went and continue to go through the 30 some odd years of fighting against Chicago police torture and John Burge, if we weren't able to be able to not only have legal victories along the way, but also and I think both of you really understand this and have been at the forefront of doing this, is changing the narrative. Following what one of the people that I have much respect for as a historian or as a people's historian, of course, Howard Zinn, in changing the narrative. And in the Hampton case, started out on the front page of all four newspapers and every TV station, it was a shootout. Panthers fired 100 shots. Hampton went down in a blaze of gunfire, firing at the cops. And fighting, starting out in that apartment for 10 or 15 days, dealing with the evidence that actually was there, we were able to participate in changing the narrative from a shootout to a shoot-in, to a murder, to a political assassination. And so changing that narrative as a lawyer, fighting to get that evidence out into the public domain and talking about it, writing about it, that to me is something that's really important, and glad to be able to do that. And it gives me some impetus and satisfaction to, in some small way, be adding to and changing that narrative.
Yeah, that's so crucial. And I appreciate you walking us through the whole situation, but especially, the movement from a shootout to a shoot in, one step at a time toward the end goal, which is to reveal this operative conspiracy that was involved. But there's the bigger story that we seem to have to keep building from. I mean, if we start with a shootout as a metaphor, right? We're constantly being dragged back to that iteration of the story that, Black people are criminals, that movements for social justice are violent anti-law and order movements. And so there's a capacity for people believing this version of events very easily. Actually, Michelle Alexander opens The New Jim Crow with her own belief in the system, right? That when an ex offender asks her to come to a meeting, and saying that there's all this conspiracy going on, or all of these ways we're being impeded, she didn't believe it, right, for that moment. So how do you deal with the repetition of the power of this story, right? Because it's a case-by-case basis, but it's a meta story, isn't it also, Flint?
Definitely. And you mentioned Michelle Alexander, and you look at it, and of course, mass incarceration, racist mass incarceration. That's somewhat of the end game of police violence, and you see it at every step, with starting with the police and the violence and the lying and the corruption that puts people of color on trial. And then you see the courts, you see the prosecutors, you see the judges, and then you see the prisons, and you see that entire continuum. And then if you go back a step, you see the schools to prison pipeline as well. And as you say, whenever the movement takes a step forward, and we see most recently Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black lives, taking a major step forward in this country, but the fight back is always fierce, and it's always very well financed. And it is always participated in and countenanced by the mass media. So yeah, it's often, it can be rather depressing to looking back 50 years. And of course, if you're a student of history, you can look back farther than that. And then you see where we are now. And you ask the question that you just asked, Tricia, which is, where are we and why does this keep reoccurring? But as a lawyer, you're kind of enmeshed in the courts, and a lot of times you feel like what you're doing, and this is why it can be a little bit depressing as well, you're always fighting back. You're always fighting against the tide. You're always fighting against the tide to change that narrative back from an assassination back to a shootout. In the police torture cases over those 30 years, it started out as, quote, police brutality alleged by a Black uneducated cop killer, and against this Vietnam decorated veteran who was a commander, Chicago police. That was the initial narrative. The narrative now that we fought for, and I'm using that in very much the collective we, the movement, and the intergenerational, interracial movements that we've worked with, is that this notorious white supremacist serial torturer tortured over 100 Black men, sent them to death row or the penitentiary for life, and that this was participated in by the highest levels of prosecutors, the mayor of the city of Chicago, Richard Daley, prosecutors, and there was a code of silence that covered this up. But we'd be kidding ourselves if we think that that's going to be the narrative that remains. And that's why the reparations that was obtained a few years ago is so significant. The reparations that were obtained included that the torture scandal would be taught to the 8th and 10th graders of the Chicago public schools during the spring semester of every year. That was part of the reparations, along with a center on the South Side to treat survivors of torture and a memorial. But that teaching, the fact that Daryl Cannon and other survivors can go to the schools, of course they can't right now, but they have been and they will in the future, to share their experiences, that I'll be able to go and talk and have talked to students, mostly students of color, of course, in our public schools in Chicago. And they can learn the history, the truth of the torture scandal, and they can connect it to their daily lives. They can connect it to what they have experienced, what their parents have experienced, what their brothers and sisters experience. So there's a tremendous importance to the education that is done in the wake of that narrative and that changing narrative.
Absolutely. I mean, it strikes me as one of the big differences between the historical moment of December 4th, 69, and even 2008, let alone 2020, is the degree to which you see the sharpening of class conflict within the Black community and the complicity of Black professionals and Black politicians to the larger white power structure. I know I've spent some good time with Brother Gator. You probably know Brother Gator. I wrote an introduction to his book. He was talking about this torture. Nobody believed it. And yet he's trying to get Black politicians. Wouldn't say a mumbling word. You talk about it in your book, right before Brother Barack Obama makes the announcement for president, he endorses Daley. Now see, that sent a major sign, like, oh, we see where you're coming from, Brother Barack. Do you know what's happening? Flint and these brothers and sisters out here trying to cast a light on their suffering, and here you siding with Daley himself, and we know Daley's in denial, so it's indifference, complicity, cowardliness, and a sense of wanting to cozy up to a power structure over against the poor and working folk, disproportionately Black in this case, but it could be any color. How do you deal with this shift that you see from 69 to 2020 with the rise of the Black professional classes, politicians, the Black bourgeoisie in general, not to demonize them or anything. We know there's decent people in every group, but generally speaking, the ways in which they have been complicit with what you've been fighting against, which was justice for Black, poor, and working people.
Did you say that your show is called The Tightrope?
You've been on that tightrope for a long time, my brother.
Well, as you can understand, particularly being a white person in dealing with these issues, in many ways, we have learned to support and often to defer to the politics of the Black and movement and the movement of color. But on the other hand, as you have seen in my book and as I've recounted, we had to deal and did deal with a lot of Black and white politicians over the years.
Sure.
For good and for bad and for indifferent. And some of the city council persons, African-American, were very supportive after a fact at a certain point. Like you mentioned, 2007, 2008, and that was a major turning point. At the very least, you had to convince those folks, if they're politicians, if they're part of the bourgeoisie, or as you characterize them, who are kind of to the left of center, might be called progressive, convinces them of the righteousness of that issue. And it seems to me that many of the people of color, even if they are not down with all the politics, they understand to some real degree mass incarceration. They've come to learn either through personal experience or through the education that's been going on about police brutality. It happens in the community too frequently for them to ignore. So if they're open-minded and they aren't afraid of taking on that issue, then you can really work in some sort of coalition or in unison with them. But you can't ever really give up the realities of the analysis of why this happens and why it will continue to happen. And of course, we're going to face that, and we're facing it already with the Biden administration, with an African-American vice president. And we know what the progressive movement is saying, where to turn. And we know the instinct, the deep, deep instinct that they all have to capitulate in the same way that Obama capitulated. Not only when he was here, but when he became president and he had that opportunity to deal with such things as the criminality of the Iraq War and the criminality of Wall Street. And he chose to just kind of pass it by. And it looks like that may happen again with Trump and his people. But that's kind of, I don't know if I really focused on what.
No, you did.
No, you did. Absolutely.
Yes, you did. Well, your first answer, which is you call your show The Tightrope, pretty much nailed it, because it is a balancing act for sure. I'm curious about Fred Hampton's capacities as a speaker. The footage I've seen of him, he's a very talented, down to earth, very smart. It's as if he's digested enough to create a narrative and a story without having anything really prepared, is what it looks like many times. And the vision. So I'm interested in him as a speaker, but also the vision, which I'm beginning to wonder if this is the thing that gets people killed the most, which is a multiracial poor people's movement, right? That he was trying to pull together. So can you speak to, one, do you think that is the main reason that he was assassinated, given all the Panthers that they could have chosen? And do you think that, his capacity to really capture where people are across race, across ethnicity, might have also made him, especially both celebrated and dangerous?
Well, I think you gleaned exactly the essence of Fred, which was he was a brilliant, brilliant young man. And I mean young. He was 21 when they assassinated him, but he was involved in the movement from a very, very young age. And he was organizing very successfully in his hometown of Maywood, which is just west of Chicago, a multiracial and very segregated suburb of Chicago back then. And he was with the NAACP then, the youth NAACP, and he built an organization of 700 young people. And he was moving to integrate the swimming pool out in Maywood. And he was already under fire and being arrested and being attacked at that time when he was a teenager. And he was being followed by the FBI at that time. And they were asking for wiretaps on his mama's house at that particular point in time. But he, like most people who seem to be able to be impromptu, Fred, he practiced speaking. He would do the nines on the block. He would listen to Malcolm. He would listen to Dr. King. And he was a student. He was a student of the movement. He was a student of the leadership of the movement. And if you see in The Murder of Fred Hampton, the black and white that Mike Gray did, there's a piece in there where Fred is representing himself at a mock trial. And it's at the same time extremely educative and somewhat humorous in the way that he cross-examines the person who's playing the cop that arrested him. But he could combine the kind of street lingo with a cutting edge, an analysis that was way beyond his years. Yes, you could see him, and he could speak in front of the federal building on when Bobby Seale was bound and gagged, which is another piece that you see in The Murder of Fred Hampton, or he could come to Northwestern Law School. I brought him to Northwestern Law School just before he was assassinated. And I'm driving him from the West Side, and he's talking, you know, he seemed paranoid to me, little white boy that I was. You know, the pigs are following us, the pigs are everywhere. And I'm thinking, wow, this man, you know, he's a bit paranoid. And I figured, you know, given Northwestern and the fact that we were almost all white boys going to law school at that time, maybe there'd be 50 people at the law school that would bother to come out to hear him. We walk into the biggest hall at Northwestern. It seats 300 people. The law school has 300 people. It's full. It's full. Everybody's there from the school. And I'm supposed to introduce him. And this is about the first time I spoke publicly, and certainly the first time I spoke in front of 300 people that were my peers. And so I got up there and I kind of stuttered and stammered. And Fred got up and kind of you know, a light but very pointed, educative way to me, basically said, and he said it in comparing Huey and Bobby Seale and Bobby Rush and himself, basically said to me, you better get your act together in terms of the way you speak. But, you know, it had, I'd love to have that tape now. But the real point to that is that he galvanized 300 white law students with basically the same message that he gave when he came out of Menard Penitentiary and went to a church on the west side of Chicago that was packed, and he did a revival type of speech there. But in each instance, he would bring the platform of the Panthers. He'd bring the anti-imperialism of the Panthers. He'd bring the Marxist analysis of the Panthers to whatever audience he was speaking to. And that made him very dangerous. It made him very dangerous that he was galvanizing people. He was bringing organizations together. And what really had to scare the people at B, the powers that be in Chicago, was that he was endeavoring to bring very powerful street gang or street organizations together, the Blackstone Rangers, which had thousands of members, and who the police were more than satisfied to prosecute on the one hand and let them kill each other on the other. But Fred was bringing the message to them, no, we have to organize, come together as a community and deal with the oppressor. Don't deal with each other. And that message, as well as the Rainbow Coalition message, and the fact that he could so brilliantly articulate it to so many different types of people. And he was speaking every day, everywhere. So yes, in answer to your question, I think that made him a target that Chicago FBI first understood, and they then got the people in Washington to understand, and ultimately to use the COINTELPRO program to set him up to murder.
That is so true. And I would just add one footnote, brother, and you tell me what you think, because you knew Brother Fred, and that is, they knew he couldn't be bought. They knew that he wouldn't sell his soul for a mess of pottage. They knew that he was the real thing, and he couldn't be co-opted for just carrots or status or money. See, that's a spiritual condition. That's a moral sensibility. You know what I mean? That's integrity in that sense, you see. And this story, I mean, you think now you got a vanilla brother from Westboro, Massachusetts, coming through Brown that connects with this chocolate brother from Maywood, Chicago. And they have this deep comradeship and friendship and human and humane interaction. and your lives become so intertwined that part of his afterlife is still at work in your life. And you become one of the great storytellers of the truth of his life, his genius, his talent, his service, and so forth. I have one question. It begins really with the epigraph of your text. Brother Fred used to say, you have to, if you dare to struggle, you must believe you win. And then if you don't win, you don't deserve it. But what makes you think that America has the capacity, as given the power structure in place, to really treat the masses of poor and working people, and especially masses of poor and working Black and brown and indigenous peoples, with the kind of dignity they deserve? Is it possible for the grand vision of our dear brother Fred Hampton to ever be realized in the America that we know?
Well, there's a show here in Chicago that I go on, and I'm kind of a regular correspondent to, and it's called This Is Hell.
This Is Hell, that's the name of it.
And you're a regular correspondent.
That sounds like Dostoevsky and Dante at the same time.
Yeah. And they have a lot of left people on it, and the host, last question he asks is what he calls the question from hell. The question that I don't want to ask, he says, you don't want to answer, and the people don't want to hear your answer. It was a gigantic question from hell, Cornel. But without turning the tables and asking you to answer that question, because you might be in a better position than I to answer it. I can only say that I guess hope is something that we have to have to continue what we're doing. Hope not only based on the fact of the history as we understand it and interpret it, all of the people, whether it's John Brown or Nat Turner, or, we can name so many people that have fought from the beginning of the struggle and have pushed the struggle forward, only to be pushed back, but then to push again. And now we saw Fred Hampton and the Panthers and the Rainbow Coalition pushing that struggle forward. And then there was the fight back, as there always is. And now we have the movement for Black Lives and all their allies pushing again in a way that has to be very, very encouraging to us on a certain level. That young people of course, we're of that older generation. Tricia isn't, but maybe Cornel and I are.
Thank you, dear. I'll take it. The sun is setting, so I'll take it.
But more seriously, we have to believe that, right?
Right.
We have to believe in our movements. We have to believe in the movement forward. We have to believe that in the same way that as you say, a white kid from Westboro, Mass, can comprehend and in some small way be spiritually moved in the indigenous sense of spiritualism.
Right.
To continue this work and to identify with that movement. There are countless people now in the movement that are doing that same thing. And people, there are many young Fred Hamptons. They may not be as dynamic speaking wise, but they are leaders, and they are leaders, and they are coming up against that resistance. But we can only hope that they will be able to fight through it, and hopefully they'll listen to us, because we're their elders. We need to listen to them. We need to take strength from what they're doing, whether it's the movement for Black Lives, or whether it's the young students in Florida who were so courageous after the mass shooting down there. So we look to them, but they have to look to us. And if we continue to do that, I think we can continue to make some progress. And we have to believe that, right? Otherwise we go back home and just quarantine, and watch
right.
Netflix all
That's
day.
right. That's right. So I mean, I would say that cheap pessimism is a form of cowardliness, and easy optimism is a form of adolescence. And therefore, hope is inextricably tied to other virtues. Hope's a virtue as well as a verb. So you got the act, and hope is an effect very much of the action, but the hope is inseparable from the love. Your love of Brother Fred shines through. So you're going to pursue the case. If you had the chance of a snowball in hell, you're still going to pursue it, because when you love somebody, you're going to do it no matter what. And if you love justice, you're going to pursue it even if it has the chance of a snowball in hell. So that the love and the hope is inextricably intertwined. It's like loving your mama. It's like loving your daughter, right? I mean, you got to bear witness to that love, no matter what the circumstances are. And that's what helps keep us going if you are trying to be like Fred, the real thing. You see, if it's just a lifestyle choice, then you're not going to stay on that too long. You see, you could have been a lawyer for 3 months, radical lawyer, end up in Wall Street and make $100 million and living somewhere out in Montserrat. You know what I mean? No, you stayed right there in the heat of the struggle because you had a love and a justice that was driving you, and the hope became an effect. You generating hope based on your witness.
Exactly. Yes.
Is that a fair characterization?
Well, I'll leave that characterization to you, but it certainly is a wonderful characterization. And I think, yes, I think that it was indelible.
Absolutely. It's just on the inside, something on the inside.
That both Fred in his life and the murder of Fred and how they did it and why they did it has just, driven not only me, of course, but all the people.
Right. That's right.
And I'd be totally remiss if I didn't count them among just some of the most important people in supporting. We support each other. We fight these fights together.
We tied together in that way.
If it wasn't Jeff Haas in the 18-month Hampton trial, if it wasn't for him and John Stainthorpe and the torture trials, and now with Joey Mogul and so many other lawyers in my office over the years who have stepped up and we've supported each other, and we've told each other we're not crazy, that we need to keep going. We did have points where we could have, turned in another direction, and probably people wouldn't have faulted us. If we didn't go back to trial a second time in the Andrew Wilson torture case because we had no finances, and at that point it seemed like we had no hope of winning the torture cases. I doubt a few people would have faulted us, but there was some spirit, and as you say, the hope, the caring for justice and caring to fight against racial injustice and white supremacy that we made that decision to go back and fight the case a second time, and the rest is, as they say, history.
Right. Right.
People's history, as they were.
People's history.
I'm really, I think I want to emphasize, a connection between what Cornel said and what you said, which is that, Cornel described you, even though you wouldn't agree with this description of yourself, as creating hope, right? Not just being hopeful in your disposition and in your actions, but that your actions also generate hope. And I think this is very important. I wonder if you could speak to the families of Fred Hampton and other people who you have defended posthumously or not. How do you think they've experienced your sacrifices? I mean, I know if I were in their shoes, it wouldn't be just about winning or losing, but knowing that there are people who have other choices, who are choosing my struggle, who are choosing my community's struggle. Even when the wins are so rare or few and far between, and certainly not guaranteed. But there's something about the hope that I think it fosters. Is that a fair characterization of your experiences with the families of the people whom you've, pressed on to try to find justice for?
Yes. Let me speak a little bit to that, projecting hope. And when I try to speak to as many, law students as I can and other students, and I kind of half facetiously say, but it's kind of true as well. I say, well, I'm still here. I'm still fighting this. This gives you some kind of example that you can do it too, and that you can sustain it. Because if I'm here 50 years later, then you
Right.
can see that it's doable, that
Right.
it's important for me to do it.
That's right.
In fact, if you're making a decision whether to go into that law firm to pay off your debts, and we know that that's a major encumbrance for even very aggressive law students. Think twice about it. Think about there are ways that you can follow what you believe in. And I always try to emphasize that, because when I was a young lawyer, there were the Arthur Canoys and the Bill Kunslers and the Lenny Weinglasses and the Ernie Goodmans and the Bill Goodmans who set the example
Right.
for us
Mm,
as
right.
moving lawyers. But in terms of the families, as you asked, Tricia, Mrs. Hampton, I like to say I had three mothers. I had my mother, who was a wonderful woman. She lived to be 99, and my mother wasn't political, but she was open-minded. And as her children, my older sister, who was a leader in the feminist movement in terms of, she was an educator, and my younger brother, who joined the movement, we were able to educate my mother, and she always supported us, and my father did as well. That was mother number one. Mother number two was Mary Powers. Mary Powers was about my mother's age, and Mary Powers was a white woman from the suburbs who, even before Fred Hampton was assassinated, devoted her life to fighting against police brutality. She started an organization called Citizens Alert, and until her death 2 or 3 years ago, she fought all of the important battles as a community activist with regard to police brutality, Fred Hampton, police violence, torture. But then, of course, there was Mrs. Hampton. Now, Mrs. Hampton was, I wouldn't say my third mother. She was certainly, those three women were the examples and of what a mother really means to someone. And Mrs. Hampton, every year, we'd go out there on December 4th and we'd speak, we meaning Jeff and I, and until Jeff moved away. And she'd have a wonderful dinner. And we'd always go for the dinner. We were always in touch with her and with Fred's brother, Bill, and his sister, Dee Dee. And it was just like an extended family, the Hampton family, and myself and Jeff Haas. And the strength that I mentioned before that she had coming to court, hearing that scandalous things said about Fred every day, and standing up for the righteousness of him. I mean, how could you not have undying respect for her? And through her, I came to understand the strength of mothers, and particularly of African-American mothers. Because the mothers who supported the men who were in the penitentiary who had been tortured, the men who were on death row who had been tortured, they were like Mrs. Hampton, just had that tremendous strength. And it didn't really matter to those mothers. It may have mattered, but I mean, their son might have been guilty of what he was charged with, might have been innocent. Might have been and probably was wrongfully convicted, but the strength that they had to support their sons, no matter what, to fight against the torture that had been committed against them, just as another remarkable thing that I have experienced, and it's something that I always want to bring forward. And I want to talk about Mrs. Hampton, and I want to talk about the mothers. Not only in the support they give their children, but also many of those mothers, like Mrs. Hampton, were bellwethers of the movement. the movement against police torture. They spoke, they speak at rallies, and they visit, and they don't take no for an answer. Sometimes when you look at the legal case and you say, there's no chance here, the mothers don't see it that way. You know what I mean?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's where that love and courage comes through.
That's right. That's right.
Oh,
Yeah. But, it's so important, what you're saying there is, some people might say, well, all mothers think their kids are angels and they're blinded. But what I hear you saying is something much more sophisticated and important, which is that even those parents and mothers whose sons may have done some kind of crime, right? Conducted a crime, they are still not supposed to be tortured for it. We know this. And their belief is, look, my kid may not be perfect, but you are mistreating him. And I'm going to stand up not only for his rights, but for the principle that our kids need to be treated like they matter, right? I mean, that's ultimately what Black Lives Matter is focusing on, this idea that when we don't matter, right, we're subjected to all kinds of things. And so it isn't just about defending our kids, which is, important, but it's about the principles on which we're defending them, which extend beyond our individual children. And even if they're not, whether they're guilty or not at that point, because it's about humane treatment, right? I mean, that's what I'm hearing you emphasize, which I think is important.
Oh, definitely. That's definitely a very important point, that these mothers, along with the people in the movement, whether it was just them and 10 other people standing in front of, the county building or the state of Illinois building in 10-degree weather, holding up signs saying my son was tortured, that they not only supported their sons as sons, but they supported the fact that the movement that was raising up the issue of the systemic and systematic torture that they were subjected to.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
It reminds me of that moment in Raising in the Sun by the great Lorraine Hansberry when she's telling Beneatha after she's put down Walter like a dog. He's been hanging out with his gangsters and lost the money. And you all remember that moment. She said, I that taught you how to measure a person. And you measure a person when they're high, you measure them when they're low, but it's precisely when they're at their bottom that you find something to love, because whatever action he committed, his humanity is not fully realized in that action. There's something else about him. And that sense of love, and that's deeper than justice, you know what I mean? Because the justice is a critique of the system itself. All the predatory capitalism, the greed, the hatred of white supremacy, and so forth and so on. But that love drives the justice, but it's deeper than justice. That's why they say any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. If you don't have the care and the concern and that deep hesed that the Jewish brothers and sisters taught us about, that steadfast love, that loving kindness, that's deeper than just justice.
Right.
See, that's a force, whereas the justice is systematic arrangement. And you need a critique, you need both tracks in that way. But Lorraine Hansberry understood that in such a powerful way. Of course, she was, strong leftist and Marxist in her own way, secular freedom fighter, but she had that spirituality that is so important that can sustain, brother like Flint into his seventh decade and still on fire, still got the same fire and the same love and justice, brother.
And we still need him to be fighting out here, right? Because things are not as different as we'd like to think. We need every ounce of strength you have.
Isn't that the truth?
Well, I'll be working on that.
Well, we're so delighted to have you with us, Flint. It was really fantastic. And, it's very encouraging. And I think, a lot of young people, as you said, we all need each other because, the police are not really fundamentally different than they were 50 years ago on many of these matters. There have been procedural changes and, consent decrees and this, that, and the other. But the fundamental concerns that you've dedicated your life to remain. And I think young people need to know that while things are different, they're also pretty darn the same. And we need as many freedom fighters as we can get, and people willing to use the legal system, to make the changes that are necessary, and to try to fight for things that we know we might not win, but we're going to keep fighting anyway. So you're an exemplar, as Cornel would say, of
Oh,
this
yeah.
very type of person. And we're just grateful that you spent some time with us on the tightrope.
Well, I'm very pleased to do so with two of my heroes and heroines. December 4th is such an important day to all of us, and we have to keep the memory of Fred Hampton alive. As you mentioned, Cornel, as he often said, dare to struggle, dare to win. Don't dare to struggle, then God damn it, you don't deserve to win.
Yeah, you got that. Yeah, that's it. That epigraph, the torture machines. No, indeed, you one of the great ones, brother. The history of American lawyering, the history of American legal practice. One of the great ones, man.
Well, thank you so much, Flint. We really appreciated having you on the tightrope. Keep us posted, and know that you're welcome back. Say hello to the family, and we'll see everyone out there next time on the tightrope. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Indeed. Stay strong, my brother.